My name is Nora Daniels. I'm 40. And last Friday, I found an invitation wedged between the seats of my husband's car. The cream-colored envelope had his company logo embossed in gold, announcing a celebration for his promotion to vice president. Below his name, printed neatly, was the guest list for the family table. Her name, Chelsea Parker, sat beside his, right where mine should have been. I stood in the driveway reading those lines until the ink blurred from the morning light. Daniel's parents were listed too. All of them seated together under the word family. My name was nowhere. The silence of that realization felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. The paper trembled just slightly in my hand. Not from anger yet, but from the weight of being erased. When Daniel walked out carrying his travel mug, he didn't notice me at first. I asked why I wasn't invited, and he smiled like he'd rehearsed the answer. "It's a corporate dinner. Not personal," he said, already turning toward the car. I told him, "Your parents are personal. Your ex is personal." He laughed softly and said, "It's optics." Nora. I watched him drive away, the taillights cutting through the mist, and felt something in me lock into place. I wasn't crying. Not even close. I was counting. Every detail, every omission, every line on that invitation became evidence. That's when I stopped being his wife and started being his audit. Daniel came home late that night, still in his tailored suit, smelling faintly of champagne and effort. I held up the invitation without saying a word, and his eyes flicked to it before he reached for a bottle of water. "Why am I not invited?" "Daniel?" I asked. He didn't flinch. "It's a corporate dinner." "Nora. Strict guest list." I told him his parents' names were on it. And so was Chelsea's, printed beside his. He smiled like the problem was small enough to smooth over. "She's a consultant," he said. "It's optics." I let the silence sit between us before asking, "Optics don't include your wife?" He sighed and said, "You wouldn't fit in with that crowd." Quote. The words slid out easily for him, each one practiced and dismissive. "You own coffee shops," he continued. "They're executives, investors, people who understand the industry." I folded my arms and said quietly, "You mean people who speak your language?" He shrugged. "Exactly. You'd hate it anyway," I told him. "Maybe. But I'd still expect an invitation to my husband's celebration." He looked at me then. Really looked. But only long enough to measure the risk of continuing the conversation. "You're overreacting," he said. "This isn't personal." "Do." I asked him if his ex being at the family table counted as professional decorum. He blinked. And that half-second of stillness told me he knew I wasn't bluffing. "Chelsea's helping with our distribution strategy," he said quickly. "She's part of the project." I told him that sounded convenient. He smiled again. That thin corporate smile that always meant he was done listening. "You're making this bigger than it is." I said, "No. Daniel, you already did that when you cut me out." He rolled his eyes and reached for his phone, muttering something about having no time for drama. I didn't stop him when he walked away. The front door clicked, and the quiet that followed felt almost peaceful. I stood there with that cream envelope still in my hand and said softly, "I hope optics keep you warm tonight." Then I folded the invitation once, slid it into the drawer beside the keys, and made a note of the date. Some people journal to cope. I just keep records. The next morning I opened our joint account, expecting the usual: rent, payroll transfers, and the quiet order of routine. What I found instead were 3 large withdrawals marked as business investment. I stared at the amount: $65,000. 10,000,000. $65,000, and the same memo line typed in Daniel's habit of capital letters. I called Robert Haynes. My accountant, and told him to pull every transaction we'd made in the past year. He asked if I was expecting something specific, and I said, "I'm expecting betrayal in spreadsheet form." Robert chuckled softly, but the silence that followed told me he sensed this wasn't a joke. He promised to call back within a day. I spent the afternoon replaying Daniel's words about optics and realized how easily someone who hides behind charm can rewrite loyalty as inconvenience. Robert called that evening, his voice steady but clipped. "You might want to sit down," he said. I told him I was already there. He explained that the withdrawals went to an entity called Clover Collective LLC, a new company registered under Chelsea Parker. My pulse stayed calm, almost unnaturally so. "You're sure?" I asked. "Positive," he said. "And there's more." He said the authorization forms bore my signature. Clean and confident. Except it wasn't mine. "That's your husband's handwriting on a signature that isn't his to use," Robert added. I asked how long it had been happening. He said 18 months, maybe longer, and that the pattern suggested intent. Not accident. I wrote down every figure, every date, every falsified note, each one a breadcrumb leading straight back to my marriage. When I confronted Daniel later that night, I kept my voice even. I told him there were unexplained withdrawals, and he said he'd moved money for a short-term investment opportunity. I asked who with, and he hesitated just long enough to tell the truth without speaking it. "You think I'm stupid?" I said. He shook his head. "Too calm. Too rehearsed. You're imagining things." "Nora," I told him. "I wish I were." After he went upstairs, I reopened the bank records and printed every page. Each line item was a confession disguised as data. And every number told me exactly who I was married to. I didn't feel heartbreak or rage, only precision. Numbers don't lie. They just wait for you to look closely enough. That night I filed the pages in a blue folder labeled Clover and placed it in my desk drawer beside the invitation. Betrayal has a pattern, and I had just learned how to read it. 2 nights later, Daniel came home humming the way he always did after a win. He poured himself a drink and said, "You look tense." "Nora, long day?" I told him it was productive, then asked if he'd been working with Chelsea recently. He froze for half a second before answering. "She's consulting on distribution again." "Why?" I said. "Because your distribution strategy seems to have cost us nearly $200,000. His hand tightened around the glass, but his voice stayed even. "You've been going through the accounts," I said. "No, Daniel. I've been going through the evidence, too." He laughed under his breath, the kind of laugh that covers panic. "You think I'd steal from you?" he asked. Pretending to sound amused, I told him, "I think you forged my signature." He shook his head slowly, lips curved into something between pity and contempt. "You've always had a suspicious streak," he said. "That's what happens when small business owners get paranoid about big players." I told him, "This isn't paranoia. It's theft." He said. "You're making a mistake." I told him. "No, you did." He sighed and said, "Clover Collective is legitimate. Chelsea's running it. Not me. She needed capital. I helped." I asked. "With my money?" he said. "Our money. It's an investment that benefits us both." I told him. "That's interesting, because the only one profiting seems to be your girlfriend." His jaw tightened, and he said, "Watch how you talk about her." I smiled and said, "Funny. That's what wives used to say about mistresses." He muttered, "You don't understand business." And I replied, "No, I understand loyalty and I know when it's been sold. He turned away, muttering that I'd ruin everything if I kept pushing. I told him, I'm not ruining anything. Daniel, I'm uncovering what's already broken. His silence stretched long enough for me to know he'd given up pretending. Later that night, while he slept, I opened his laptop. The password hadn't changed. I scrolled through folders named consulting reports and vendor files until I found one labeled Clover. Inside were invoices, emails, and wire transfers linking Chelsea's company to mine. Every document was signed off by him. Every approval stamped with my name. The same handwriting. The same lie. When I closed the laptop, the room felt strangely still. Betrayal doesn't shout. It hums like a refrigerator you stop hearing until it's gone. I whispered, optics. Right? And the word sounded like a joke that had lost its punchline. The next morning, Daniel left early for another meeting, and I stood at the window watching him drive away. He thought he was protecting his empire. He didn't know I was already dismantling it. One signature at a time. I met with Robert the next morning at his downtown office. He had the files ready, stacked neatly, everything color-coded and precise. You weren't wrong, he said. Clover Collective is registered under Chelsea Parker, but Daniel's digital signature appears on every wire authorization. I asked if the transfers could be traced directly back to our joint account, and he nodded. Every dollar. He moved them in waves, small enough to avoid scrutiny, but together it's about 200,000. I told him to print everything and make copies. He said quietly, Nora, this isn't just marital trouble. This is fraud. I told him I was aware and asked if he'd testify if needed. He said, if it comes to that. Yes. He handed me a folder and said, you'll want legal counsel. Someone sharp. I told him I already had someone in mind. On my way out, he called after me. Be careful. He's not the kind of man who admits when he's cornered. I didn't look back. Some truths only settle when you stop flinching at them. That afternoon, I went through Daniel's office while he was gone. His email was still logged in. I searched Clover, Chelsea, and distribution strategy. The results filled the screen. There were spreadsheets comparing my cafe's pricing to another shop's, emails about replicating supplier contracts, and a message from Chelsea that read, Velocity is ready to launch once we secure the final vendor deal. Congrats. Partner, I whispered. Partner. And the word tasted like rust. That night, when Daniel came home, I told him we needed to talk. He tried to deflect, saying he was exhausted. I said, you'll want to stay awake for this. He looked at the stack of papers on the table and frowned. You went through my files, he said. I told him. I went through my future. He scanned the documents, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't have done this, he said. I told him. You shouldn't have made it necessary. It's not risking, he said. You don't know the full story. And I replied, I know enough. He tried another tactic. Chelsea needed help. I was just investing, I said. With forged signatures and stolen business plans, that's not investment. Daniel, that's sabotage. His voice rose. Sharp now. You're destroying everything I built. I told him. You built it with my money and my trust. I'm just reclaiming what's left. When he stormed out, I didn't follow. I spent the rest of the night scanning every document, labeling each file, and organizing them into folders for my attorney. The evidence was clean, comprehensive, and damning. It wasn't revenge, it was record-keeping. At dawn, I emailed the files to my lawyer and to Robert for safekeeping. Then I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and watched the light rise. Betrayal might begin in the dark. But evidence always looks better in daylight. The night of Daniel's promotion arrived like a performance everyone but me had rehearsed for. He left early in his tailored suit, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "Try to relax tonight." I told him, "I plan to." He smiled, oblivious, and said, "Good. I need no distractions tonight." I said, "You'll have my full silence." The door closed behind him, and I sat for a moment in the quiet, listening to the sound of absence. Then I opened my laptop and logged into the company's public event stream. They were broadcasting the dinner live for shareholders. The Metropolitan Ballroom gleamed under bright light. I found him at table 3, sitting between his parents and Chelsea Parker, her hand resting on the stem of her wine glass like she belonged there. The camera caught his smile. Perfect and polished. The host said, "Tonight we honor Daniel Reynolds, our new vice president of sales." Applause followed, and Daniel stood to deliver his speech. "Success," he began, "isn't built alone. It's built through trust, teamwork, and vision," I whispered to the screen. "And forgery. It's no I do," he continued, thanking the executive board. Then Chelsea for her strategic insight. My phone buzzed Robert's message. "All documents delivered to your lawyer. Secure and time-stamped." I typed back, "Perfect." Daniel raised his glass and said, "To partnerships that endure." I said softly, "Some don't." The room clapped again. But my focus stayed on the moment his smile lingered too long in Chelsea's direction, his eyes holding the look that once belonged to me. When the speeches ended, the cameras shifted to a close-up of the tables. Chelsea leaned in and whispered something that made Daniel laugh. I recognized the gesture. It was the same one he used to make after telling me, "You worry too much." I told the empty room, "Not anymore." Then I stood, packed 2 suitcases, and placed my wedding ring beside the coffee maker where he'd find it in the morning. Before midnight, my attorney confirmed she had everything ready for filing. I told her, "He'll be too busy celebrating to see it coming," she said. Timing is everything. I watched the final frame on the live feed, Daniel shaking hands with the CEO. Champagne raised high, his future hanging in his own words. The caption beneath the stream read, "A night to remember." I smiled and whispered, "It will be." Then I closed the laptop, locked the front door, and walked away from a life that had already ended long before the applause stopped. Daniel called the next morning, his voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "Where are you?" he demanded. I said, "Exactly where you left me." He asked what that meant, and I told him, "It means you'll find out soon." He said he didn't have time for riddles, that the office was in chaos because someone had leaked internal files to legal. I said, "That wasn't a leak. That was disclosure." He paused, then said, "You turned me in." I said, "No, Daniel. You did that when you forged my name." I knew. He tried to regain control, the way he always did. "We can fix this," he said, "if you drop whatever you've filed." I told him, "It's not a filing. It's an audit. And the numbers don't lie." He muttered something about lawyers exaggerating and claimed Chelsea had nothing to do with it. I said, "She's listed as co-founder on Clover Collective. I have the registration papers." He fell silent. And for the first time, I heard panic instead of pride. "You don't understand what you've started," he said finally. I told him, "No. Daniel, you don't understand what you ended." Ice. By noon, his promotion announcement had been pulled from the company's site. The board suspended him pending investigation for financial misconduct. Reporters were calling by evening, and Chelsea's smiling headshot vanished from every company page within hours. My lawyer sent me an update. Internal audit confirmed unauthorized transfers, and the case had been escalated to the district attorney. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled. The kind of release that comes when you've been holding your breath for too long. He called again that night. His voice cracked now, stripped of its corporate polish. "Please," he said. "You've made your point." I said. "No, Daniel. I haven't. The point was never about you losing everything. It was about me getting mine back." He said. "You're going to destroy me." I told him. "You already did the hard part." Then I ended the call and blocked his number. The next morning, the paper ran a headline about fraud allegations at Meditex Holdings, and his name sat beneath it in bold print. I closed the browser and whispered. Optics looked different in daylight. The collapse wasn't loud. It was methodical, precise, and final exactly the way he had taught me to be. Daniel showed up at my cafe 3 days later, eyes hollow, voice frayed. He said, "You've made me the villain in a story you don't even understand." I told him, "I didn't make you anything. I just stopped editing your version." He looked around the shop. At the customers ordering lattes. At the walls painted in the color he once called too modest. He said, "You think this makes you better than me?" I said. "No, Daniel. It just proves I was always enough without you." Ow. He leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "They're coming for me. Nora, the board, the DA, everyone. You could stop this." I said. "Why would I?" he said. "Because we built a life together." I told him. "We built a lie together. You just mistook it for a life." He exhaled, a sound somewhere between rage and defeat. "You can't win like this," he said. I smiled slightly and said, "I already have." He said, "You'll regret humiliating me." I told him, "Humiliation is a public experience. Daniel, accountability is private. You're just not used to either." He said. "Chelsea's gone. She turned on me the second things fell apart." I said. "That's what happens when you build alliances out of greed. They collapse at the first sign of truth." He stared at me for a long moment, eyes red, and said, "I never meant to hurt you." I said, "You meant to use me. The hurt was just collateral." "It is talk it," he said. "You've always been colder than I thought." I told him, "No, I've just stopped mistaking calm for forgiveness." He said, "You'll walk away from this with money. But no one wins." I said, "Maybe not. But at least I'm not the one who lost himself in the process." He laughed once, bitter and small. "You think this makes you powerful?" I said. "No, Daniel, it makes me free." When he left, he didn't look back. I watched him step into the daylight. The man who'd once lectured me about optics now shrinking into the crowd like a shadow without a source. My lawyer called an hour later and said the plea agreement had gone through probation. Restitution. Forfeiture of assets. I said, "Good. That's closure." Then I hung up, locked the door, and poured myself a cup of coffee. It was quiet again. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand explanation. 6 months later, the cafe was busier than it had ever been. The new downtown location opened with lines around the block. And for the first time, I felt the kind of exhaustion that came from building something honest. A customer asked if the business was named after someone, and I said, "Just a version of me that refused to stay quiet." They smiled and said, "Then it's the right name." I nodded. Because it was. One evening, A supplier I'd worked with for years stopped by with a delivery and lingered over coffee. His name was Mark, a man who'd once helped me negotiate contracts when Daniel was too busy pretending to lead. He said, "You look lighter these days." I told him, "That's what happens when you stop carrying people who never plan to walk with you." He laughed, said, "That's a good line," and asked if I'd join him for dinner sometime. I said, "Maybe," and meant it. Later that night, I closed the register and sat alone by the window. The air smelled like roasted beans and rain. My lawyer had sent word earlier that Daniel's restitution payments had cleared. Final and complete. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The past had been paid for, I whispered. Debt settled. And the words felt like peace. When I locked up, I caught my reflection in the glass, steadier, quieter, still standing. I remembered Daniel saying I'd never make it without him. I smiled and said to no one, "You were right about one thing. Success takes partnership." I just chose mine better this time. The city hummed outside, indifferent and alive. And for the first time in years, I walked home without looking back. Thank you for listening to my story. Some chapters close quietly. Others end with a door finally locked. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and stay a while. There are more truths waiting to be told. Until then, take care of your peace. And never apologize for protecting it.